Hello guys, KnucklesUp or Michael here, and boy do I have a video for you. As you probably guessed from the title, today we will be talking about what remains of Edith Finch. For the few of you that didn't catch the video game awards this year, they took home the prize of Best Narrative.
All right, and the award goes to What Remains of Edith Finch.
Prior to that award, and before playing the game with my literature/media class, I had never heard of it, but I'm glad I got the chance to play it. I enjoyed it very much. The art, narrative, sound, and everything in between was great. Now before I go any further today, I must warn everyone here that I will be digging into this game quite heavily, which means lots and lots of spoilers, so I highly recommend you go play the game before watching this video. It'll help you understand what's going on. You have been warned. Just to recap, for those of you that have forgot, or those of you that are here for a spoiler, What Remains of Edith Finch is told from the perspective of Edith Finch. She returns to the house she grew up in after many years of staying away from it. Why? Well, there was clearly something suspicious going on regarding the family, as all of the members had been dying, mostly young and in unexpected ways. The curse, as they called it, took the lives of many among those in the family. Your job as Edith is to navigate the old house to discover what happened to the rest of your family. After playing from the perspective of Molly, Calvin, Barbara, Walter, Sam, Gus, Gregory, Lewis, and Edie, the deaths become crystal clear. You find that all remains of the Finches is a newborn baby, courtesy of Mother Edith. While playing the game, there was always something that never sat right with me. I breezed past it initially, but I couldn't help but feel that there was something more to it. In the game, you play from many different angles, but not all of them. Sven, Kay, Sanjay, Dawn, and Milton are characters that you never get to experience from a first-person perspective. Let's look at that last one. Milton. Milton was introduced right at the start of the game. In fact, the opening few lines deal directly with his mysterious disappearance. Later, you climb towards the top of the large house and enter into his room, which doubles as an art studio. You take a look at a flipbook left on the table, sketch his name onto the family tree, bada bing bada boom, Mr. Worldwide as I step in the room, and they never talk about him again. But that's it. Kid went missing, he likes to paint. What next? Well, sadly nothing. As I said, you don't actually get to find out what happens to him, and he's not really brought up for the remainder of the story. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you are in luck, as I have put in the hours to figuring out what the hell happened. Now, what can we draw from What Remains of Edith Finch about Milton? He's the son of Dawn and Sanjay, brother of Lewis and Edith. Milton is 11 years old at the time of his disappearance. He is a black-haired kid who simply loves to paint. That's not very much to work off of, if I'm being honest, especially when trying to figure out what happened to him. Let's pause for a moment. While making this video, I kept trying to figure out what happened to Milton, but the most important question we need to know is who is Milton? We already covered his story in What Remains of Edith Finch, but there's another game, believe it or not, that we need to take a look at in order to figure it out. And this game is The Unfinished Swan. Again, big spoiler alert in full effect for this game, The Unfinished Swan. You have been warned. The Unfinished Swan was created by Giant Sparrow, the same company that made What Remains of Edith Finch. The game came out in 2012 and received some well-deserved praise. In The Unfinished Swan, you play as Monroe, a boy who recently lost his mother. I'm noticing a pretty dark trend on these games, some sad stuff. Anyway, Monroe's mom was known for painting vigorously. She loved it. That said, she was awful at finishing any painting that she started. Upon her death, Monroe was told by the orphanage taking him in that he could only take one painting. He chose his mom's favorite, which was a swan that she had not finished, hence the title, The Unfinished Swan. Amid a dream, Monroe flies into the painting to chase after the swan tries to escape. It's a pretty cool story. Why is it important though? Well, look no further than the king. The king is the main focus of the narrative and the story. Yes, I'm recording for my media studies. It's okay. Well, look no further than the king. The king is the main focus of the narrative and story, specifically on his love of painting. He uses his magic paintbrush to paint structures using black, white, and gold colors that you see in Monroe's dream. He is fascinated by art and architecture. So, what's the comparison? Well, there is no doubt in my mind, 0% zip, zolch, zada, zhisto, badumba, whatever word you use for zero. It is very, very clear that Milton is the king. Right off the bat, Milton and the king are both creative painters who make some very impressive work. The magic paintbrush is used by the king to create the walls of his kingdom, while for Milton, the magic paintbrush is used to cross worlds from one game to another.
The king's new subjects were tired of white. They were tired of tripping, of banging their shins, of misplacing their homes. So they started painting everything, ruining the king's spotless design. In response, the king outlawed all non-magical brushes and pledged to spend the next month painting shadows for his kingdom.
Their looks are essentially the same. The king is an older looking version of Milton. The only few differences are that the king is much taller, much larger, and he has a beard. A 3D diagram exists in Milton's room that exists within the real space of the kingdom. The only colors that the two use to paint are white, black, and gold. Coincidence? I think not. Anyway, you still don't believe me? Let's look at more. Well, riddled throughout Milton's room is a logo of a mustache and a crown, which I will just call the crown logo for the sake of this video. The king's signature mark is the crown logo. It is seen all throughout the kingdom, and it is seen all throughout Milton's room. In addition, they both wear crowns in person as well. Interestingly, the king reveals a drawing of his first house, as he calls it, in The Unfinished Swan. In What Remains of Edith Finch, there is a similar room with heavy natural light, a few photos, a rug, and a fireplace. They look quite similar. Finally, my favorite indicator is the most subtle of all. The king recalls a childhood moment in which he made his first sandcastle. It was unfortunately toppled over, and that made him very sad.
The king hated the sea, and all because of his very first castle. It was the only one he had ever come close to finishing, and it took him a single day. But then the tide came in and washed it all away. He vowed that someday he'd build a kingdom that would last forever.
But there is not a single grain of sand that exists within the kingdom where he lives in The Unfinished Swan. If you look at the surrounding environment of the Finch house, it is clear as day that there is grass, trees, rocks, and everything in between, and there's a small beach that has some sand on it. That is most likely where Milton and the king made their first sandcastle.
That's all, folks.
I really wish that it is truly all, folks, but it's not. See, we have made the parallel between the two games, but what happened to Milton? The connection we have examined between the two games has helped me draw a fairly logical conclusion regarding the mystery of Milton. Milton suffers from schizophrenia and accidentally caused his own death. Now, I know a lot of you are wondering how I thought of that from the little detail that existed within the games. What Remains of Edith Finch provided the foundation and details for the theory, while The Unfinished Swan sealed the deal on this theory. Let's first analyze why this is certainly possible. What Remains of Edith Finch is quite a realistic game. It depicts real ways people met their death. For the younger players' characters, it could be argued that they're not as realistic, but I would like to say that because they are young, the developers wanted to use more imaginative imagery involved in order to create that childlike perspective. For example, Gus did not actually swoop up chairs with his kite, but at such a young age, he probably imagined gliding with the furniture, or how Greg pretended he was a frog when he was underwater in the bathtub. Regardless, all of the deaths have logic, except Milton's. By comparing the seemingly rare but possible deaths that occur among the family, it seems impossible that among such realism, a kid can simply hop out of a fake door and go missing forever. That's because he didn't. That unexplained mystery is out of place. There has to be a more logical solution. Now, let's talk schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a mental disorder in which a person struggles differentiating reality from fantasy. The most clear symptoms are vivid hallucinations, and they can include any and all of the 5 senses.
We could do great things together, you and I. I like you. Unfortunately, I'm a little chained up at the moment, and I can't help you realize your true potential. But you can change that. Find that key, bring it to me. Set me free.
No, you don't own me.
That's where you're wrong, boy. His eye pulls the strings round here. And if you don't set me free, we're gonna have a problem.
In addition, schizophrenics are often delusional, lethargic, disorganized in speech, and in physical space. Those suffering from the illness are often very impulsive and childlike. Now, how can we determine for sure that Milton is schizophrenic? Well, to be honest, we can't. Unfortunately, this is the problem with the theory. I can't prove with 100% certainty that Milton is schizophrenic, but I can make a damn good case for it. Let's start with genetics. 1% of the world's population is diagnosed with schizophrenia. Just think about that for a moment. You're in a room with 100 people. Assuming everyone is under the age of 45, there is at least one person in that room with the disorder, or one person that will develop the disorder until they reach the age of 45. That's pretty crazy when you think about it. That said, 1% isn't very high, but we can increase that percentage for sure. Let's look at the family tree of the Finches and see if Dr. Knuckles can examine them in any way, shape, or form. Well, there is Milton, but I'll go into depth on him later. Then we have Lewis. Now, Lewis is the best example of someone with schizophrenia in the game. His whole playable experience revolves around captivating hallucinations, which ultimately lead to an accidental suicide. We can also see Lewis lifelessly shut down from his mother as she pleads for him to go home. His drug use, state of isolation, lack of motivation, and prime target teenage years for the disorder make him an extremely viable candidate to have schizophrenia. To further prove this, the best evidence we can find is in the psychiatric note, in which Lewis says, "My imagination is as real as my body." That's about as far from reality as you can possibly get.
My imagination is as real as my body, he told me. It was hard to argue with him.
Based on his vignette and the psychiatric report by the doctor, it is more than fair to say that Lewis has schizophrenia. Then there is Edie. Yeah, the sweet, lovable granny isn't all that innocent. The most glaring piece of evidence for Edie having schizophrenia is in her vignette. She explains that the tide rolled far out and she wandered into the water, which had turned to just rocks at that point. While this is certainly possible, the things she found within where normally the water would be is not so realistic. She sees a deer at first, which is definitely possible, as the deer could have probably run out into the forest looking for something and stumbled upon this rocky area that had normally been water, but it's not that likely. But you know what? Let's give her the benefit of the doubt, but it's hard not to argue this is the case from hallucinations when she opens a completely intact gate that is submerged underwater for years. You mean to tell me that this gate stayed perfectly like this for 80 plus years it was under the water, plus being closed and not being able to show a single hint of water damage to the gate? Not bloody likely. If that still isn't enough, she sees the house lights being turned on as she approaches it. Let's be clear about this too. This house was submerged underwater for the exact same time as the gate, almost close to 100 years. And if you still don't believe me at this point, she even admits herself that she has no idea what she's seeing and she's clearly hallucinating.
I started seeing things. But when I saw them, they felt like old friends. That night, a lot of things came back to me. Things I can't explain, but that I need you to try and...
Edith, what are you doing in here?
Well, that's not all. Edie is hands down the most delusional character of any person to have ever lived in the Finch house. Exhibit A. When describing Sven's death to Edith, she claims he is killed by a dragon, which is technically true. Rather than claiming a dragon fell on him while he was trying to build it for the kids, she constantly keeps up the charade that Sven was literally killed by a fire-breathing dragon. Some could argue that this is some sort of storytelling method, but in reality, when you look at the way she describes things and says things, it makes more sense that she's actually believing it at this point.
When Edie told people Sven was killed by a dragon, she could also have said he was building a dragon-shaped slide that collapsed. She could have, but she didn't.
Exhibit B, not to mention that towards the end of the story, she completely evades the nursing home and impulsively disappears because of her delusions about the house. The final piece of evidence comes from an argument between Edie and Dawn. She warns Edie about the wine with her medication.
To our final night together, and all our final nights apart.
Grandma, you know what I said about alcohol. Some of your medications are very
Edith,
specific.
I left a present for you in the hallway.
When doing research about all the possible medication for treating schizophrenia, there is not a single one of the main 10 that is used commonly that can be taken with alcohol. All of these schizophrenic medications have some pretty serious side effects when taken with alcohol. Ranging from the lowest end of the totem pole, we have risperidone, which will make you pass out and go to sleep, all the way to the most extreme, thiothiazine, which can actually cause death if consumed with with alcohol. Now, I understand that a decent amount of medication shouldn't be taken with alcohol, but the medication combo with Dawn's concerns means that it is definitely possible that Edie is using meds to treat schizophrenia. If there was no harm with taking these meds with alcohol, then the theory would have ended right then and there, but meaning that there is problems with her taking alcohol with her medication, it is certainly possible that she's taking medication for schizophrenia. Well, these are the main two suspects, Lewis and Edie. By taking a look at all of their deaths and the family tree, it could be very likely, though, that most of the Finches are affected by schizophrenia. Look no further than Odin, Walter, Gus, and surprisingly, Edith. While the evidence is not as strong for the rest of these characters, there is certainly potential. Odin impulsively leaves most of his family and his life back in Norway to sail across to America. Mind you, not to have a better life or to be in better circumstances, but in order to escape a deep family curse. If that doesn't sound delusional, I don't know what was. Walter, after traumatized by his sister's death, isolates himself for the next 45 years. Schizophrenia is most susceptible among those who are extremely isolated. They begin to lose their minds. Walter had nothing, or should I say, no one. Then we look at Gus. Remember earlier when I said that he had imagined moving the furniture? Well, maybe he didn't imagine it, but rather hallucinated. Not to mention his clear disobedience, intentional isolation, lifelessness, and prime age for the disorder, Gus is a very target suspect for having schizophrenia. And finally, Edith. This may come as a shock, but by piecing together her journey through the house and how she died allows us to make this case. You either believe me on this, or you don't. But Edie, while discovering death after death, does not imagine what they think, but she relives them. For one, it is very vague to associate some of the artifacts with some of the deaths. For example, Barbara's is the most literal, as you can be reading word by word in a story, so Edith, perhaps, if she wasn't hallucinating that, she could just follow along and gather what she got from that comic book. But look, for example, like a more vague one, Gregory's telephone conversation. How can she possibly draw a conclusion of Gregory's death without concrete information? The phone line conversation doesn't even remotely relate to what Gregory's doing in the bathtub. It is a completely unrelated conversation, so to me it seems impossible that Edith was able to get that sort of information from a non sequitur conversation. I believe that the deaths within the game are not actually realistic of what happened, but more so Edith's perception of them. Not to mention the ending. In the ending, it is revealed that Edith's child goes to the house to lay flowers by now dead Edith's grave. It is unclear how she died, but most likely due to childbirth based on what the story has given us. In the decade 2010, our medical care is so advanced that it is extremely rare to see mothers die during childbirth. However, mothers with schizophrenia have double the chance of dying during childbirth, and within the following year, a schizophrenic female has 5 times greater likelihood to simply drop dead and die than the average female. This could potentially explain why Edith is dead at such a young age despite seeming pretty healthy. So, on this family tree, there are a number of potential suspects. Now, back to Milton. How likely is it that Milton has schizophrenia? Let's go character by character. As Edie and Lewis are the most concrete cases of people with the disorder, going right off the bat for Milton, he has around a 15% chance of getting the disorder, compared to the average 1%. If we take into the account the other characters, Milton goes from 15% to 29%. At the lowest, Milton is experiencing a 1% rate like the rest of the world and like everyone watching this video right now, but most likely he's at a 15% rate in order to get the disorder, and that's pretty high. At the possible highest rate of developing schizophrenia, he's at 29%. But wait, there's more. This is simply taking into account the gene pool of his family, but not Milton himself. When he disappeared, Milton was age 11. Age 11 is the prime age for developing schizophrenia, as the disorder is most common among young men aged 10 to 18, with schizophrenia developing within those first few years between 10 and 13. In addition, Milton, like his brother Lewis, isolated himself constantly through the separation of his room from the rest of the house. He was in his room constantly painting by himself without anyone else by his side. When taking all of this into account, Milton's likelihood of developing schizophrenia has jumped from a fair rate of 15% to around 25%. Not to mention that if the extreme percentage is true, at around 29%, then that statistic jumps to around 40%. God damn, that is a lot of percent. Now finally, here's what I believe happened to Milton. Earlier, I said that Milton used his magic paintbrush to jump from one game to the other. Not one game to the other, but from one mental state to his mental state of someone affected by schizophrenia. I believe that What Remains of Edith Finch is actually a prequel to the Unfinished Swan game, a game that is about Milton's hallucination before he died. In the Unfinished Swan, the king claims to have left his first house, the one we distinguished as the Finch house earlier, to which he walked into his garden and to his kingdom. The garden area resembles the front driveway of the Finch house with the trees and the bench. Both have very similar feels. Afterwards, I believe Milton continued his hallucination into the forest, to which he died due to either starvation and dehydration or an accident. As he was hallucinating for some time, perhaps days, the lack of water, food, and sleep could have killed him. More likely, I believe that the environment around him caused his death. Around the Finch house is heavy forestry and cliffs. Milton wandered too far, tripped on something, potentially a rock, and fell to his death and drowned perhaps. After he died, the Finches could not locate his body and reported him as missing. The last piece of evidence that I want to bring up is how the games tell their stories. If you look at What Remains of Edith Finch, we see Edith Finch walking around the house and reliving and telling stories. The Unfinished Swan, on the other hand, is very, very, very different. As opposed to having a first-person perspective of all the events that occurred, The Unfinished Swan is told as a storybook that has already taken place in the past. It is important to note that looking at the storybook, it does look like a child's book, as the pages are very horizontally extended. A big book with not that many pages and a lot of art in it is generally tended to be a kid's book. And most kids' books out there aren't non-fiction. Most of them are just funny stories based off of maybe other folk tales and things like that. They're not meant to be taken seriously. But why is this important? This subtle distinction pretty much proves that the story of The Unfinished Swan is fiction, while the story of What Remains of Edith Finch is true. What do I mean by this? From the crossover moment where Milton was fine one moment and then the next moment he began to experience signs of schizophrenia, he crosses over to another story that's fiction. The story of The Unfinished Swan, according to Milton, is completely fictitious as it is a hallucination. It's hard for him to distinguish what's real and what's fake. The story of What Remains Edith Finch is Milton's reality, and the story of The Unfinished Swan is his fantasy. In a game of realism, I always know that there's something off about simply jumping through a door and going into another game. It just doesn't make sense. There was something more sad and sinister than that. I believe that the curse talked about in the game is not actually a curse, but instead a series of mental health disorders that has claimed the lives of many people within the family.
Remember, that's just a theory. A game theory. Thanks for watching.
I'm sorry, I've never done a game theory, so I kind of feel like I had to do that. Anyway, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below if you agree, if you disagree, if you have some more questions to ask, because I'm always up for debate, and I'm always up to hear what other people think about this. If you enjoyed that, drop a like down below, subscribe if you have not, and as always, I will see you guys in the next one. Peace out.